will also have with us Professor P.K. Malhotra. He will join us shortly. And he is the distinguished professor, School of Law, and former legal secretary, Ministry of Law and Justice of Government of India. We have with us Professor Pradeep Kulshrestha, Dean, School of Law, Sharda University. As far as today's topic is concerned, in order to fully implement human rights, we need to place more emphasis on the responsibility of all actors and not just states to take action together to make sure rights are enjoyed. One problem with the word responsibility is that people often use it in the common legal meaning, focused on who is to blame or liable. This is what Iris Young has called backward looking responsibility or the liability model. She focused on political responsibility that is forward looking. This kind of responsibility asks not who is to blame, but what should we do. Forward looking responsibility is necessary to address what should we do. So, forward looking responsibility is necessary to address the coronavirus pandemic and to think about what we should do in the world after the pandemic. This framework is useful in the context of the coronavirus crisis because it involves both a range of rights and responsibilities of many actors in order for everyone to enjoy these rights. All actors socially connected to this problem and able to act must practice responsibilities that are not always well defined. So, to protect our collective right to health, we may need to recognize that we have a right to freedom of movement, but also a responsibility not to travel in certain circumstances. We have a right to education, but a responsibility to accept that it may be suspended temporarily or delivered online. This balancing of rights is foreseen in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which speaks of limiting rights to respect the rights and freedom of others. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights goes further, however, and recognizes that each of us has duties to the community, and its preamble calls on all of us to promote rights. The drafters were keen to highlight that realizing the full potential of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a collective effort. So we should concentrate on our right as well as we should be focused on the duties to the community. So now I would like to invite our Dean, Professor Pradeep Kulshrestha, to welcome our Honorable Justice Mohan. So please, sir. Sir, your mic is muted, I think.
I can't hear, Professor.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Homa. Dr. Homa, thank you very much. It is my proud privilege to welcome Honorable Mr. Justice Mohan Pieris, President's Counsel, former Chief Justice, Supreme Court of Sri Lanka, and he was also Attorney General of Sri Lanka. And Mr. P.K. Malhotra, he is former Secretary, Union Ministry of Law and Justice, and he is Distinguished Professor with the School of Law. Very shortly, he will be joining because some technical issue he is facing in this webinar on the right to liberty and duty to the community during COVID-19 pandemic. Sharda University School of Law has taken this initiative to organize series of webinars on relevant legal issues during this COVID lockdown. The basic objective inter alia are that we upskill our learning from the great wisdom of the distinguished legal luminaries. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in French Declaration in 1789 said the France National Constitutional Assembly and the basic human civil rights documents from the French Revolution proclaimed right to liberty. And this right to liberty has found prominent place in the preamble of the Indian Constitution as well as Union Charter and many other international declarations. So the preamble to the Indian Constitution declares liberty to be one of the main cherished goals of the Constitution. And Article 21 provides for the right to life and personal liberty. At the same time, Article 21 empowers the Parliament to make a procedure which can curtail the right to life and personal liberty. We all have our personal liberty and other rights, but at the same time, we have certain duties also towards the community. So, in this regard, the first declaration, that is Article 29 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 1948, it casts certain duties on all of us. The first is everyone has duty to the community in which alone the free and full development of his personality is possible. Second is in the exercise of his rights and freedoms, everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law solely for the purpose of securing due recognition and respect for the rights and freedom of others and of meeting the just requirement of morality, public order, and the general welfare in a democratic society. 3. These rights and freedom may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of United Nations. So we have liberty on one hand. At the same time, we all have our duties to the community. And Indian Constitution originally had no duty part, but in 1976, so 42nd Amendment brought Article 51A, and through this Article 51A, certain duties were cast upon the citizens. So, and these duties are sacrosanct to ensure the full enjoyment of the freedoms. And today's webinar we have kept basically to see that how much personal liberty can be exercised in these times of COVID-19 and how much duty we should exercise towards our community. We have seen world over people are opposing the restrictions upon their liberty, or especially of lockdown. We have seen in California people are going to beaches to defy the lockdown norms. In India also we are seeing some people are defying the lockdown norms. So in this webinar we will be listening our distinguished speaker, and we'll try to understand that how liberty is possible in such times and how much we should be concerned about others' welfare also. So with these words, I on my own behalf and on the behalf of the management, faculty, non-teaching staff, participants and the students extend a very warm welcome to the distinguished speaker, Honorable Justice Mohan Pieris. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Now, without any delay, I would like to request our main speaker, the Honorable Mr. Justin Mohan Pieris, to speak on the topic. Please, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Omar. I'm delighted to hear the words spoken by Professor Kulshestra and Dr. Omar in the last few minutes. I would simply say that I fully concur and agree with every word they said, and I will probably refer to the same text at a later point in my presentation. My dear students, let me first of all thank the Dean of the Department of Law, and that's Professor Kulshestra, who has been kind enough to invite me to address this webinar, and Dr. Omar, who introduced me to you just a few minutes ago. And I'm happy to be able to deliver this keynote address at this webinar in these exceptionally difficult times. I can only recall the last visit to Sharda, which was quite a wonderful experience. My dear students, we are at a time which I would describe as exceptionally difficult. Why do I say that? I say that because it is a time in which mankind has been made to look so insignificant by Mother Nature. Strangely, that is the case. We have been reduced to nothing. Many a philosophy has propounded perhaps in the last 3 months, in search for an answer to the true meaning of life. At a time in history when mankind is considered having mastery over our environment and perhaps even the planet, or even to be more accurate, even beyond the planetary system, when we considered ourselves virtually playing the role of God Himself, but to be sooner than later made to realize that we are microscopic, helpless beings in a planet that hovers around one of the lesser stars. Think about it. My dear students, I'm asked to talk to you today on the rights to personal liberty and our duties towards the community in the context of the pandemic. Students, I asked the question, did we need a pandemic to beg that question? I repeat myself, did we need a pandemic to beg that question? Are we not asking that question as the result of our utter hopelessness in the face of the real threat to our very existence? That's why we are asking the question, otherwise we would never be asking that question. Shouldn't we have been asking that question perhaps much earlier? Is it something that we paid scant regard to? Did it ever occur to us to ask ourselves that question? I'm asking the question, then, what have we been doing with ourselves? The question seems simple, but pretty difficult to answer. I will leave you to find the answers to those questions. And I'm fairly sure you will end up saying, mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. In other words, through my fault, through my fault, through my most grievous fault. So much so that in some parts of the developed world, people are even willing to go down on their knees on the streets, praying for pardon from their Creator, whom they hitherto did not even know. He didn't exist. My dear students, that is the pathetic irony that humankind has been placed in today on this planet. I'm sure Dr. Oma would have she referred to Catherine Young, and in that same context, at least to the author Young, she would have read the writings of the Spanish writer Catherine Sicking in her book, The Hidden Face of Rights, towards the politics of responsibility. And she, in that book, makes the observation that for a comprehensive implementation of human rights, there is a need to place greater emphasis on the obligations cast on all stakeholders, not just governments, with a view to take action together so as to make sure that rights are enjoyed. The writer says that even if all governments were taking efficient action and individuals didn't also do their share by staying at home and taking all the precautionary measures, the corona crisis would not be averted. Now, she goes on to argue that all stakeholders socially connected to the injustices in the structure and have the capacity to do something about it need to take action to address that injustice. It appears that one of the issues is the understanding of this whole word of duty, or perhaps responsibility, if you were to put it in another context. The word responsibility is often used in the context, as Professor Oma was pleased to observe, in the context of who is to blame or Who is liable? Those are the questions, because we are teaching you to think like lawyers, not like human beings. And lawyers do tend to complicate simple things. Lawyers do tend to can complicate simple life. So we put it in a jurisprudential paradigm. Who is to blame? Who is liable? And as she quite rightly observed, and referring to Iris Young, who talks of a liability model. And as Dr. Omar was pleased to observe, Iris Young has set her sight on a forward-looking political responsibility. She's quite right. A political responsibility that is futuristic, that doesn't ask the question, who is to blame? But on the contrary, to ask the question, but what should we do? As it goes on to suggest that it is this forward-looking responsibility that is required to address the pandemic, to enable us to plan as to what we should do on this planet post-pandemic. My dear students, you will agree that this might be a framework which might be beneficial in the current context, because as was observed, it connects up with a range of rights and responsibilities of a very wide canvas of stakeholders. You will appreciate that our right to liberty, as Dr. Omar was pleased to observe, the freedom of movement, our right to education, our right to information, our right to our food, shelter, and to health, all these things come into focus as they themselves have the potential to rain havoc, you will agree, with all these activities. My dear students, if we look around us, we will see many countries adapting very strict, perhaps border foreign policies to keep people out, for good reason, of course. Most of our rights to movement are compromised. Whether we like it or not, governments need to strike a balance in the protection of all those rights, particularly the protection of our right to good health and the protection of human rights. There is no question about it. You will recall the Secretary General of the WHO on the 12th of March, just last month, of this year, was pleased to observe that quarantine is a legitimate state policy in terms of health emergencies. But the state that has to be qualified. But subject to the qualification that the state must attend to the rights of individuals caught in a quarantine to adequate healthcare, food, and shelter. My students, if one looks at, as your professor just observed a few minutes ago, at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you will see that the Declaration speaks of a limitation of rights. For what? For the purposes to ensure the respect for the rights and freedoms of others. The rights and freedoms of others that are so sacrosanct. The Universal Declaration goes even further and decrees that each one of us has a duty to the community, while there is a loud cry to all of us to promote human rights in the very preamble of that declaration. So you will agree with me once you read it that the draftsman of the Universal Declaration brought about that strong message that if the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was to fully blossom, so to speak, it has to be by a joint, collaborative, collective effort by all stakeholders. You will therefore observe, as the academics put it, that in order for all citizens on the planet to enjoy these rights, everyone who is connected socially to the problem and who have the capacity to take some action about it must activate themselves and take action to practice those duties. as Dr. Omar was pleased to observe, the definition of which may not always be clear. We can't spell it out. Let's look at a few examples, my dear students. Take, for example, our right to health. Now, how do we protect our right, that right to health? Now, you will agree that in order that we may protect the right to health, we surely must recognize that there's a price to pay for it. There's always a quid pro quo to that right, to the enjoyment of that right. So that in order that we may protect it, we must surely agree and recognize that there is something that we might have to give up. For example, we might have to give up the right to the freedom of movement. Why? Because we have an obligation not to travel in certain circumstances. Because the very act of traveling might compromise our right to health, such as in the current context. Let's look at another example. Let's look at the right to education. You will agree that we might have to well accept the position that it can be suspended temporarily, like what we are doing right now, that you and I are engaging in. Our children do not go to our schools. You are not able to go to university. Very frequently these days, I'm resorting to information technology to be with you. Your professors are doing the same thing. So one must therefore appreciate and concede that the World Health Organization, right, and the recommendations are very proactive, and that those have come in very handy in the last few days. Now, just a while ago, I did make the observation that in order for all stakeholders to enjoy these rights, that everyone connected socially to the pandemic must practice these obligations that, as we said, are not well defined. My dear students, the performance, you will look around us, look around the world. The performance of different countries is varied, you will see, whilst some of them are faring badly, some of them are faring well, some of them are faring perhaps moderately. So you will therefore appreciate that the responsibility that society has to bear does not end with national governments. As Professor Kuchesra was pleased to observe, some of them are seen on the beaches. They spend scant regard for what we are saying. So you will agree that they percolate, these responsibilities percolate or go down to state governments, local bodies, healthcare institutions, the media, non-governmental organizations, universities and schools, all the way down to each and every citizen. My dear students, our responsibilities in the context of COVID-19 at a very simple level, of course, has been the washing of hands, to wear a face mask, staying in at home, and have to be well educated with regard to what the pandemic means and not to be guided by misinformation. Sounds funny, isn't it? Because it's such a simple thing. I saw a little story the other day on the internet, a little baby asking the question, what, mom, are you talking about? After all, what's so big about corona? Because it's a matter of washing my hands with a little bit of soap. It's that simple, it's so childish. But I'm asking you to pause for a moment and ask yourself the question, how the simple washing of hands with soap has developed into a new norm and has become a global governance issue. Think about it. It's shocking, isn't it? Although I have to sound cynical and remind ourselves that we do wash our hands off on many issues, shunning thereby from the responsibility, as Pontius Pilate did, on that infamous day. You will agree that individual duties and obligations must and would include inaction, such as, for example, not holding essential merchandise. A simple example would be not buying the mask that you don't need and probably allow that mask to be bought by someone who really needs it. So it is observed that individuals don't go about observing their social responsibilities on their own, but they do go about doing it with institutions and social connections with others in practicing the social distance necessary to limit the transmission of COVID-19. My dear students, the academics seem to suggest in the context of the travel bans that a futuristic policy on rights and obligations undoubtedly needs greater coordinated national and international response. That it requires more and better global governance for solving the pandemic and the inevitable economic crisis that it will surely give rise to. My dear students, you will agree that perhaps the biggest challenge we have today is to find an answer as to how we can use this crisis as a stepping stone to a new future for global governance, rather than wash our hands off from the problem. I must concede that this discussion begs an answer to the question as to what extent can a government lawfully restrict the liberties of its citizens in order to serve the common good of the nation. Some of you might ask yourselves the question as to what extent has the protection of the public welfare be compromised by governments to take measures to curtail some of our rights? $1 million question. My dear students, I can assure you that this is not a novel situation unknown to mankind. And this tension between the need to protect the community and our fundamental rights over the aspect of public health and the acceptance of its measures is nothing new. It was seen during the policies to combat infectious diseases in the 19th and 20th centuries. Remember that. This has been an enduring tension between public health and individual rights, which we have, of course, swept under the carpet, consigned it to the limbo of forgotten things at our own peril, of course. So, what have I got to say? Let's look at the judicial pronouncements on this matter. If I was to summarize it in a few words, our courts, more through an abundance of caution and perhaps fear, if nothing else, having many jurisdictions have come down in many of these jurisdictions have come down in favor of the protection of public health in preference to individual rights and liberties. Whether we like it or not, that's how it has developed. It has been seen through most of the 20th century that the wide powers that public health authorities had enjoyed remain almost unchallenged. But during the last decade of the old millennium, there appears to have been a shift of attitude to the vigorous developments of jurisprudence on privacy and the revolution on due process, which visited the aspects of the right to prisoners, the rights of mental patients, and those under the power of the state. Now, I might mention that it is in passing that it was the HIV/AIDS epidemic that virtually forced a complete rethinking of the dominant ideology of public health. You will recall that the biggest, perhaps, the challenge, the you will agree that the biggest challenge we have today is to find an answer, as I said, as to use this crisis as a stepping stone to a new future. The judicial pronouncements, as I said, have come down on the side of they have been almost unchallenged. But during the last millennium, the 10 years of the last millennium, I said we actually have seen a shift. The HIV/AIDS epidemic, my dear students, if you recall history and if you do a little bit of searching, set the stage to canvas and to speak about a new paradigm of public health. And I do submit that there are lessons to be learned from that approach to the paradigm to be adopted in our approach to the rights and duties in the context of COVID-19. The proponents and defenders of civil liberties, my dear students, were able to say that no tension existed. Interestingly, they attempted to reconcile this. And they said that there was no tension that existed between public health and civil liberties. If you think about it, that's quite true. That on the contrary, they were able to say that policies that protected civil liberties would support the policies of public health, and that any policies that was prejudicial to the rights of human rights would subvert public health. I'll say it again. They went on to say that any policy that protected civil liberties would support the policies of public health, and that any policies that were prejudicial to the rights or the human rights would subvert public health. Quite true, isn't it? Think about it. So you will therefore appreciate that that policy which was true for HIV/AIDS can also be true for public health in a general sense. So a question has always also that has been asked is how true it was to say that there is no tension between public health and civil liberties. Is that correct? Let's examine that. It must be therefore appreciated, and you will appreciate if you think about it, that public health surveillance for epidemics and pandemics is crucial in order to understand the pattern of the disease and the planning and the execution of action to remedy that disease. Now that's very important, and that's what most countries are doing. Now these questions, my dear students, cannot be answered without confronting the tensions between the interests of individuals and those of the community. Just to remind you, and if we look back for a moment at SARS or MERS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, which was the precursor to COVID-19, or perhaps in the same family, we would easily see how difficult it is to make the decisions between conflicting rights in the face of perhaps uncertainty. In retrospect, one might say that quarantines imposed in the face of a potential epidemic were more expensive than necessary. But we do know that in the face of an evolving threat to public health officials had no choice but to weigh personal liberty against potentially serious threats of the disease. My dear students, the legal literature on the subject seems to clearly suggest that public health measured collectively in terms of the lives of individuals and on a population basis requires intervention that involves restrictions of choice. On the 11th of March, again, I remind you, the WHO declared the outbreak of COVID that had reached the level of a global pandemic and called for governments to take urgent and aggressive measures set to stop the spread of the virus. You will appreciate that the international human rights law provides a guarantee to persons to the highest attainable standards of health and medical care. Human rights law also recognizes the fact that where there is a serious public health threat and public emergency that threatens the life of the nation, that there is a justification for the restriction of those rights. My dear students, restrictions that are strictly necessary, that's what's important. Restrictions that are strictly necessary having regard to scientific evidence, restrictions which are not arbitrary, restrictions which are not discriminatory, restrictions which are in limited duration, respectful of human dignity, restrictions that are subject to review from time to time, and restrictions which are commensurate with the doctrine of proportionality. You would therefore agree that the scale and severity of the pandemic undoubtedly gives rise to a threat to public health that would inevitably justify restrictions on certain rights. For example, the right which are curtailed from the imposition of quarantine, limiting the freedom of movement. I must strike a note of warning at the same time. And we must ensure that we practice human rights in a manner that is, as I said before, non-discriminatory, transparently, and with respect for human dignity, and protect ourselves from harms that come from the imposition of unnecessarily harsh measures that can severely compromise our rights. I might take this opportunity to briefly refer to the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, which decrees that everyone has the right to the highest attainable standards of physical and mental health. I might remind you of the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which is the monitoring body for state compliance with the covenant, that has made the observation that the right to health is closely related to and dependent upon the realization of other human rights as contained in the International Bill of Rights, including the right to food, housing, work, education, human dignity, life, and non-discrimination, and perhaps most of all, to the right to equality. So therefore, my dear students, the right to health provides the health facilities, provides that the health facilities must be available, it must be accessible, it must be acceptable, and perhaps medically important. Now, I might actually, in passing, remind you of the Syracuse principles adopted by the United Nations Economic and Social Council in 1984, which provides authoritative guidance on government responses that restrict human rights for reasons of public health or national emergency. They have to be, it says, lawful, necessary, and proportionate. You will also bear in mind, dear friends, I think I have left you with perhaps quite a lot of material to ponder upon this great debate of how we balance personal liberty as against our duty to the community in the context of a global novel virus that keeps us confined to our homes already for over 2 months, and hopefully not for a few more months, is already, what is it doing? It's reorienting our relationship to government. It's reorienting our relationship to the outside world and even perhaps to each other. Now, this reorientation, my dear students, that is foreseen in the times to come might make us feel unfamiliar with these new things, or perhaps rather unsettling at times. So what is the question then that will haunt us? The question that will haunt us for sure will be, right? Will nations stay closed? Will nations stay closed? Will touching each other be something strange? Think about it. What would happen to my favorite restaurant? The question then is, where is the human being in me? Where is the human being in my neighbor? But remember that moments of crisis such as this also lends itself to opportunity. Remember that the more sophisticated and flexible use of technology reduces incidence of polarization. It revives an appreciation for the environment as we see and other simple pleasures of life. It has given us greater time for leisure, which no doubt we would soon be perhaps intolerant of. How can we manage with so much of leisure? I'm afraid I cannot prophesize exactly what will come. But here is a forecast which I found of a prophecy that one academic puts that has a serious impact on the dream, I say, the dream of our absolute freedoms and our personal liberty. This academic says, the comfort of being in the presence of others might be replaced with a greater comfort of absence, especially with those who don't know, whom we don't know intimately. Look at, you're talking to thousands of people, thousands of miles away, without even perhaps knowing them. Instead of asking the question, is there a reason to do this online, the academic says, you'll be asking the question, is there any good reason to do this in person? How ironic. It sounds silly, isn't it? My dear students, the online contact will create more distance, while no doubt it will give you more connections. As we communicate more often with people who are physically far away and who feel safer to us because of that distance. After all, why should we be scared of a man who is thousands of miles away? My question to you, who then is our community? Who then is our neighbor? Think about it tonight. My dear students, you will then see a new kind, as the academic says, a new kind of patriotism. When will you start to understand patriotism more as cultivating the health and life of your community, those around us, rather than blowing up someone else? Think about it. All these days we were thinking of blowing up someone else somewhere in some part of the world. Did you ever think of the man in the next village? Did you ever think of the man who probably walks down the road to Greater Noida? No. You will start thinking about them very soon. It is just possible that the need for demilitarization and love of your own community will be one of the benefits to come out of this major debacle. Then the academic goes on to say that there will be a decline in polarization. I say this in the context that given our current level of tension at every level of society, we are talking rights. The pandemic scenario suggests that the time is right to begin to promote constructive patterns in our cultural and political discourse. Our political discourse is full of aggression, isn't it? Because after all, that's our right. Is that the kind of right that we want? Is that the kind of liberty that we want? There will come, my dear students, a serious attitude in our people that expertise matters. It was easy to reject and ignore environmental and medical experts until the pandemic arrived at our doorsteps. So long as it happened in Venezuela, so long as it happened in the Ural Mountains, so long as it happens in some insignificant corner of the planet, it didn't bother us. It was a nice talking point or perhaps a drink. Then the academic says there will be less individualism, as one academic puts it. And she says this pandemic marks the end of our romance with market society and hyper-individualism. Think of it. This pandemic marks the end of our romance with market society and hyper-individualism. We will reorient our political ethos and make substantial investment in public good for public health and public services. We will become less communal. Thank God for it. We will become and we will be able to see how our faiths are linked, irrespective of our ethnic differences, irrespective of our nationalities, irrespective of our religious differences and cultural differences. My dear students, the coronavirus is going to cause immense pain and suffering. But from a human rights point of view, we will be forced to reconsider who we are and what we value. And in the long term, it will help us to rediscover the better version of ourselves. You will be able to see yourself in your neighbor. Your neighbor will be able to see himself in you. The real human being in us. The magic, in other words, of creation. My dear students, COVID-19 will sweep away many of the artificial barriers for moving more of our lives online. We may perhaps use our time with our device to think the kinds of community we can create through them. Those are the rights, those are the liberties that we would have. We will be asking the question, what can I authentically offer? I have a life. I have a history. What do people need? If moving forward we apply our human instincts, therefore, to our devices, that, I say, will be a very powerful COVID-19 legacy, wouldn't it? Not only alone, as the academic puts it, not only alone together, but together alone. What a beautiful way of putting it. So, my dear students, finally, may I say that the list appears to be unending. There are many lessons, and it is my final wish that we will be rid of this terrible menace of COVID-19 and that we would find the right blend and balance our personal liberties and the duty towards our own communities. I hope this little discourse that I have left you with will help you to think carefully of the balance that we need to strike between our rights and duties and what we owe to our communities. After all, remember that we are just a minor planet hovering around a million other stars. That's how small we are. So we need to jealously guard our planet by jealously guarding and balancing those rights so finely, balancing those rights and freedoms against for the benefit of our neighbors and to our community. Perhaps the Lord Atkins' famous principle, the neighbor principle, might come in handy, although that was said in respect of liabilities in tort or delict. Look at the neighbor principle. It is exactly that we adopt in this balancing of duties as against to the rights of our community. Thank you very much for giving me a patient hearing. I hope these few thoughts have left you enough material to think about, and I'll be pleased to take any questions that you might like to ask me. Until we meet again, good luck in your studies, and I'm sure we'll be soon out of this and soon be back to our same old selves, but with a new thinking, that we will be a new student, so to speak, in the learning of the law, so that we can give life to the law. Give life to the law, which is an organic body. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you,
you,
sir.
Honorable Lordship.
Thank you very much, sir, for such a wonderful lecture and very inspiring.
Thank
And
you.
I request all to write their questions in the message box.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. If messages can come in the message box, I'll be happy to answer them. Yes.
Yes, sir. Please write your questions.
Honorable Justice, by the time people are writing their questions, I want to raise a query.
Yeah,
that
sure.
the response of people in Western countries and in Asian countries have
Yeah,
been different.
sure,
How
sure.
do you justify this?
You see, if you look at the Western countries, and whether we like it or not, this is a disease actually that hits older people much more than the youngsters. Young people seem to tolerate the pandemic much better. And if you see all the activity that's going on in the Western countries, the activity really is amongst a much younger age group. What you see in the beaches, whom you see in the parks, and so on and so forth. Uh, I think that's one. The second reason is, I think the Western countries, I think they have a better understanding of the fact that of the impermanence of life, the impermanence of life. You see, we we I'm not too sure whether we have a complete appreciation that life is very impermanent. Western countries, the people in those countries have gone through two world wars. They've gone through enough trouble, and they cherish life. They perhaps value those freedoms much more than ourselves because of the difficulties that we have had, and perhaps they know to cope with the difficulties in life much more. They seem to accept what life brings out, but offers them in the ordinary course of life. So the attitude, there is one of here, I think we in the East and we in Asia are very materialistic in our way of things. We want to acquire position, power, wealth, materialism. So we are very earthly as beings. We love life. Even they love life. But what I mean is, we want to be here if we can for the rest of our till the planet perhaps ends. So that's why I said the appreciation of the impermanence of life is much greater, I believe, in the Western communities, and they are willing to take on these difficulties as they come. But of course, at the same time, I'm fairly sure that they have the same sensitivities that we have. I think that perhaps is the reason. Of course, we are far more careful. We don't want to let go what we have. Perhaps that is the reason, Professor Kusheswar. Yeah, I'm not too sure. I'm not too sure whether you will agree, but I think that is the reason. They have
Thank you,
a,
Lordship.
yeah.
Thank you, Lordship.
Now we have one question.
Yeah.
It is asked by Pratyush. He's asking that what impact of COVID-19 pandemic on human rights and the rule of law in different countries?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Uh, if there is the impact, you see, remember that the rule of law remains the rule of law, whether it is a pandemic or whether it is a state of war. That's a very important thing to remember. The rule of law never remains to be unshaken, right? Laws remain the same during war or pandemic or normal times. It is just the treatment of the law, the adaptation of the law to that particular environment that changes. You see, in you will I think there is a lovely quotation by Lord Atkin in one of these cases, which I cannot recall to mind immediately, where he says that the rules, that the law doesn't change even in times of war. That actually involved the incarceration of a particular prisoner under the terrorist laws, and where there was extra rain. Or Liversidge versus Anderson was the case. Yeah, in Liversidge versus Anderson, Lord Atkins says that the laws don't actually change even in times of war. So the rule of law remains. So irrespective of whatever in other words, what we are saying is we work within the rule of law. There is no, of course, there are instances where you derogate from entrenched rights. For example, you can derogate from fundamental rights as set out in the Constitution for very good reason. But those derogations are temporary. They must be commensurate. They must be transparent. They must be necessary. In other words, necessity. Or perhaps where we invoke the doctrine of constitutional exceptionalism. Read a little bit on constitutional exceptionalism and the doctrine of necessity, and you will find John Locke, John Donne, Carl Smith, those jurists talking of the doctrine of constitutional exceptionalism and the doctrine of necessity. So none of us, in other words, we run parallel modules, a parallel constitution, a parallel rule of laws to get over that particular problem. Make no mistake, I'm not for a moment suggesting that there is a derogation from the rule of law. No, that's not the way we look at it. The rule of law remains the rule of law and it remains sacrosanct. But it is just that we modify that to meet that particular situation. Otherwise, we would even destroy the whole concept of the rule of law. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, sir. Another question is asked by Ankit Anand. He's
Yes.
asking, what is your opinion in this present context with respect to the politics which is being played by the political parties in the name of religion targeting certain religious groups?
Yes. Now, I think I said it very clearly in the lecture of mine that you cannot make use of the pandemic to put in place discriminatory practices of ethnic groups. That will be clearly, certainly be repugnant to the rule of law and repugnant to the known standards of human rights. You cannot make use of this to discriminate ethnic groups. You cannot make use of this to discriminate on religious grounds. So let me make myself absolutely clear that the pandemic can never be an excuse for a violation of human rights. That's not the way. That's just not permitted and cannot be accommodated by any standards. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Another question is asked by Dr. KB Asthana. He's
Yeah.
asking that, in your opinion, how this situation has changed the outlook towards the relationship between rights and duties of the individuals, and how will it change the approach post COVID-19?
Now, I think I addressed that issue also in the speech, but let me say nothing has changed. Nothing has changed except, can I say this, that COVID-19 has now made us realize the importance of sitting to think about these things. One thing that has happened for sure is that people now listen, take the internet, see what's going on there. There are prophets and prophets and prophets telling us how we should lead our lives. Now, where are these people all these days? So really, this pandemic has made us sit back and think a little. Is it necessary to buy my Mercedes? Is it necessary to buy my third car? Is it necessary to go be eating in luxury hotels every weekend? Is it necessary to go on trips every other day? In other words, isn't there something more than living it up? That's the question, right? You know, we have been grounded to give us a little time to think about what we are doing. In other words, is it time for us to look to the higher things in life? So there we are. In my view, nothing has changed except for one thing, and that is that we have been given time to contemplate. And I'm fairly sure that contemplation will reassure to us a greater understanding of our rights. And I'm fairly sure that we will hear lesser people talking of rights, but perhaps people preaching and going around telling us that we should probably be living our lives moderately. The neighbor principle. I'm fairly sure the neighbor principle as propounded by Lord Atkin, or perhaps the Christian religious principle, love thy neighbor as thyself, is what probably will prevail in the future, if that answers the question. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Another question is asked by Shrestha. She's asking that what should be the first step we as a global community take so that we are better prepared for the next pandemic?
What step we should take, is it?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But I can tell you what step you should. I think there are multifarious steps that we need to take. But if I let me talk of just the law, how should the law think about it, Miss Shesra? How
Mm.
many cases do we have pending in our courts today? In India, there is 3 crores waiting to be heard. As we speak, unluckily our courts are not working these days, but every day, how many people trek into our courts and back just to be told that their case has been postponed for so many months? How many of us really walk away from the courts cursing the legal system, cursing lawyers, cursing judges? We don't have such a good reputation. So really, from the point of view of the legal system, let me tell you, it's time that we seriously give thought to our own legal systems to try and make life easier for our people. The legal system must be looked at as a facilitator to life rather than a burden. You ask a man on the street today, what do you think of our legal system? Oh my heavens, run from our courts. Please go keep away from lawyers if you can. That's the reputation we have. So that's the
Thank,
reputation that we must shed. Let's clearly look at this, our legal systems. Imagine for a man to actually come to a court and come to a court for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, generations of litigation. I can tell you, I cannot afford it.
thank you.
I cannot afford it. So therefore, from the legal system's point of view, I think one of the main steps is to completely rethink the manner in which we are conducting our legal system. Okay? Right.
Okay, thank you, sir. Another question is by Mr. Namit Kumar Srivastava. He is assistant professor in Sharda University. He's asking that maybe we are letting some of our liberties being curtailed in the face of the pandemic. But post COVID 19, whether the state would let us reclaim those freedoms again, and what would be the role of courts in the same?
The answer is yes. The answer is that we have really not lost our rights. We have merely suspended those rights. If we have a voluntary suspension of rights, look at it that way. We are voluntarily, for example, in Sri Lanka, I can tell you, we are being told, please do not, these are some of the rules we like you to follow. Follow these rules so that you can be protected. Now, if I'm intelligent enough, I probably will follow those rights, not because I'm giving up my rights, no. But I am actually doing it for myself, for my protection, and for the protection of my family, my children, my neighbors, my people in my office, people in my school, and so on and so forth. So it's not a giving up of those rights. Don't think of it that way. It's not a giving up of rights, but merely a suspension of my rights. As much as you would probably kind of restrain yourself from having a meal, if you can feed someone who has not had a meal for 10 days, it's something like that. You certainly, there's nothing to regain that right. That is an inherent right that you are entitled to as a member of the human family. Okay?
Okay, thank you, sir. Another question is by Professor Preeti Saxena. She's asking they just wish to know the role of constitutional governance vis-a-vis duties.
Say it again, Professor. I didn't quite hear that properly.
Sir, she's asking that
Yes.
she just wish to know the role of constitutional governance vis-a-vis duties.
Vis-a-vis duties. Well,
Yeah,
constitutional governance, the duties are part of constitutional governance. Constitution, you see, there is no right which doesn't have a corresponding duty. Tell me, give me one right. describe to me one right that doesn't have a corresponding duty? Quite frankly, the right actually arises out of a duty. The right arises, there is a inseparable, it's a indispensable relationship. It's actually industry, perhaps you cannot actually destroy it. It's something so intrinsically linked to each other that you cannot actually divorce duties from rights. So constitutional governance, certainly in constitutional governance, intrinsic in that principle are duties. And that is something that goes, it's in our constitutions. Of course, they're not justiciable, but we know that from judicial pronouncements, duties have also been spoken of in many of our judgments, and it's part of our law that those duties, that people must be conscious of those duties. So constitutional governance cannot be separate, cannot ignore duties, and duties must go along with rights. All right?
Yeah, thank you, sir. Another question is by Kavya Salim. She's asking, can the state bring about strong laws to curb epidemics of lifestyle diseases in India in the light of this pandemic?
Well, the answer is yes, provided the answer is yes. If there is a life-threatening disease that requires legislation to probably spell out the manner in which that particular disease has to be dealt with, certainly that legislation would be welcome. I cannot imagine any right-thinking member of the public being opposed to any such legislation, provided, of course, remember that the courts would be quick or the public would be quick to have that legislation tested for consistency with the Constitution, and certainly the courts will strike down anything that will be recumbent to the basic structure of the Constitution. So, subject to that fact, those basic structure of the Constitution that would include fundamental rights, directory principles of state policy, fundamental duties, and so on and so forth. So, any legislation that is absolutely necessary to be passed, the courts will probably sanction, provided it actually satisfies all of the criteria that is required by the Constitution. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Another question is by Lydia Devlin Anim. It has been asked that after the pandemic, will the restriction on movement still be in force for a specified time period as a precautionary measure?
Yeah. I would answer this question this way. It is for you to restrict yourself. Supposing, let's assume, for the sake of argument, that still the pandemic or parts of it are looming in some part of India. Let's think of it. Now, if you are going to travel, if you are going on a leisure trip to that part of India, wouldn't it be wise for you to perhaps decide not to go there and go somewhere else? For example, supposing there's a flood in some place, some exotic place in which you want to spend a holiday, would you still want to go there? Or would you advise yourself irrespective of what the rules are? In other words, remember, we have got to behave like reasonable and prudent human beings. In other words, some self-protection. Remember, the law expects you to protect yourself. The law permits you to do anything that it takes to protect yourself, inclusive of your right to self-defense, isn't it? So that being the case, self-help is perhaps the fundamental right in law, self-help to a lot of things. There are a lot of negative rights, isn't it? Right? As much as positive rights. So there you are. We are not curtailed by law. We are free. We were born free, we will live free, and we will die freely. That's the freedom we have. But we are free so long as we have respect for the freedoms of others. So there you are. Cherish your freedom, protect your freedom, advise yourself as to how you can protect that freedom. All right? I'm sure that should be the benchmark to our conduct, right? Okay.
Thank you, sir. And the last question that it's asked by Aditi Singh. She said that the meaning of rule of law itself is subjective across borders. So, how do we then justify it not having a uniform meaning? And
Yeah.
is it the strict application of rule of law or the idea of it you would consider supreme?
I think the whole idea of the rule of law is what is important, right? Remember, you can't have one fit for the whole world, right? What perhaps is good for China is not necessarily good for the United States, and not for Sri Lanka or for India for that matter, right? There are, you see, remember, look at the restrictions that we have. You have incorporated scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, right, by way of affirmative provisions. Now, how do you fit that into the rule of law? But we have done that, and that's for good reason, isn't it? So there you are. The rule of law is certainly a benchmark, but that benchmark must be tweeted here and there to suit the policies of that particular community. That's important, right? And there are certain, there is a jus cogens, isn't it? Right, a peremptory norm that the rule of law that incorporates. There's the jus cogens, the peremptory norms. So long as those peremptory norms, the jus cogens is left untouched, then my view is that the rule of law can be subjectively applied to suit that particular condition. But of course, as I said, you try very hard to come back to what is right, what is fair and unfair. So there you are. You see, we got to one of the things that we have to remember. We teach you in our universities. What do we teach you? We teach you law in its raw, pure sense. Now remember, this law becomes raw and pure and will remain on your bookshelves for the rest of your life. You have to give life to the law, to the spirit of the law. And it is only then that the law becomes meaningful, right? Okay.
Thank you very much, sir. Now we'll ask our Dean Pradeep Kulshresht. Would you like to say something, sir?
Yes, Dr. Kulshesra and Dr. Oma and the rest of the faculty, I thoroughly enjoyed the last 1.5 hours and 1 hour and 40 minutes interacting with you. The delightful experience. I hope we can do this more often. And I wish every student who listened to this lecture today all the very best in their studies. You can certainly get in touch with Dr. Kulshesra and Dr. Oma, and in turn get in touch with me. I'll be happy to help you in whatever way possible. Please do reach out to me, and I'll be happy to impart to you whatever I know. So good luck in your studies. Thank you, Dr. Kulshesra and Dr. Oma, and I wish Sharda University all the best in its future endeavors in the dissemination of legal knowledge. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Now, I would like to invite my colleague, Dr. Harish Kumar Tiwari, to give formal vote of thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon to all of you. I, on the behalf of School of Law and my dear colleagues and students, I would like to thank our chief guest for today, sir, that you have given much insight on the very relevant topic which is needed, that is the striking the balance between the liberty and duties, which is indispensable to contain the pandemic. So thank you so much, sir, for giving your insight on this topic. And I thank to our respected Dean, sir, who has given the opportunity to us to conduct this webinar. And I would like to thank Dr. Humavi Khan, ma'am, and all other distinguished participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harish. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Honorable Justice. Thank you, Honorable Justice.
Thank you. Okay.
Good day, sir.
I'm going off there then.
Yes, good day, sir.
Good day. Thank you.